Okay, guys, the H1B guy here. And today, the H1B guy live, stamp it out for a Q&A with discussions on immigration, election results, and more. But before we get started, I'd like to ask you, if you haven't already, to please subscribe to the H1B Guy channel here on YouTube. It helps me to produce more content like this for you. I also wanted to mention the H1B Guy offers a variety of consulting services. If I can provide you peace of mind by helping you bridge the gap between your employer and your immigration attorney, please reach out. I'd love to hear how I can help. I wanted to wish a very happy Veterans Day to all of the veterans that are out there today, November 11th, 2020. I also wanted to mention that my father served in the Air Force during Vietnam, so very happy Veterans Day to you. And that both of my grandfathers were also veterans in World War II. So if you see a veteran today, please thank one. Today, I'm joined by someone who does not need an introduction, Christine Mikolajuk, and she can be found at CMIKOLAJUK on Twitter. You've most likely read her immigration story on Medium, and maybe you've seen her interview on Tucker Carlson. Christine, I'm just so excited to have you join me today. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much, H1B Guy. I'm really glad to be on your show. And happy Veterans Day to everyone out there that's commemorating the war and all the great people who've served.
That's right. It's got to remember what they fought for, which is, as Americans, we always say our freedom, right? So today what we're going to do is we'll do our traditional Stamp It Out Q&A. Christine and I have a variety of questions and topics that we're going to cover. If you're watching, I'd like to ask you to go ahead and like this video here on YouTube. It helps with the live stream algorithm. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like for us to discuss at the end of the Q&A, I'd ask that you please post those in the comment section and we'll get to them at the end. So without, I guess, any further delay, we're just going to jump right into it. I know your story has been well documented, but can you tell me how you got to where you are now?
Sure. It's a bit of a long story, I guess. And I'm sort of dialing in or calling in from London in the UK, which is where I've lived since the start of 2019. Basically, I came to the States from Canada in, 2003. I was 17. I got into Harvard, which was a dream come true. My own parents were immigrants from Poland to Canada. So I had that experience there growing up. But I was so excited to come to the US. And a lot of people, they come to the US for college and they discover, college and all the great things that come with that. But for me, it was as much about the excitement of learning as it was about discovering the US. And so for the 4 years that I was there, I had, really patient roommates that explained what America was all about. I traveled a lot. I worked on the Hill, and I just discovered a fantastic country. And it was the first time in my life where I really felt like I was in a place where everything was on the right wavelength. But sort of towards the end of that experience, the shadow creeps in of what needs to happen for you to be able to stay in the US. And so I made the call to go to Oxford and get a degree there, and then with the hopes of coming back through the private sector. So I spent 5 years working in management consulting at a leading firm and finally got them to wrangle me a transfer. And I moved to Florida. I was with the company in Miami, which was a great experience. But there, every time you join a company, they don't want to sponsor you a green card until you've been there a while. So lo and behold, another year passed, and then another year where they were trying one way or another way. And in the end, that company just said there was no real way for them to do it. I managed to get a job in banking and had a sort of TN visa. And, again, it was another year and trying one way and trying another way. And finally, they said, well, the only way for us to do this, to let you stay and apply for a green card, is if you go abroad, spend a year abroad, and thereby be eligible to come in on an L1A, which is an intercompany transfer visa. I did that. I lived here for a year and went back to the States. And finally, and this is 2017, the company was able to apply for a green card application for me in the managerial category. And that was probably one of the most stressful times of my life. I couldn't sleep, lost my hair. And instead of getting a good inkling back, we got a request for further evidence. Further evidence was provided. And then in March of 2018, we received a denial notice. And this wasn't just me. By now, I was married to a wonderful Brit who joined me in my sort of American dream. Yeah, when we received that news, it was absolutely devastating. I mean, I'd been at it for 14 years, and the company wouldn't appeal, which is sort of understandable. And I was given the opportunity to just reapply, but by then it was clear that, you know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is a definition of insanity.
Right.
And so we made the very, very difficult and frankly heartbreaking decision, for me anyway, to leave. Yeah.
Was that at the end of 2018, or was that right after, I guess, the decision came down in March? You were kind of weighing what your options were. What was your strategy at that point?
To be perfectly honest, that entire period is a bit of a blur, because it was so distressing. You know, not least because it had repercussions on my husband's ability to work in the U.S. And by the way, he's an engineer with an MBA. So I think he'd be able to stay in his own right. But, you know, and I had to sort of outsource my logical thinking at that point and really relied on a lot of great and kind people who were able to sort of shepherd me through that. So in the end, I sort of stayed on, you know, to wrap things up, and see things through. And we moved, my husband moved midway through 2018. I joined him at the end of 2018, start of 2019 here in the UK. And I've been here since.
If you could go back and give yourself some advice before you decided to come to the US, what would you tell your 17-year-old self?
That is a really hard question, because, you know, today, given where things are now, where, I mean, green cards based on merit are virtually impossible, it would seem like a no-brainer to say, have an exit strategy, don't count on staying. And that is frankly today what I think international students who come to the US should be told. Don't expect to stay. You know, you're going to be going to school alongside Americans, but you are in a very different situation. Do not, you know, expect that the things that got you here will keep you here. I am not as cynical as say, you know, marry your buddy because that's the only way that you're going to stay.
Right.
But that would be my advice based on today. But back then, I mean, you know, in a lot of ways, I don't regret everything that I did, because if I hadn't come to the States and I wouldn't have met all the wonderful people that I've met, I wouldn't have found a place that I really call home, that I find, you know, important and meaningful to the world. But I would say, don't trust the system, because it is in fact organized to keep people like me out. And don't, you know, trust that the system has sort of your best interest, or in fact, America's best interest at heart. It's simply a bureaucracy, a mindless, faceless one. And the best you can do is arm yourself. And so I think I would have told myself to be much more cynical, much more aggressive, you know, threaten lawsuits right and left, because so many institutions, you know, especially increasingly nowadays, it's all about litigation, and it's just, you can't really trust that things will work out if you do things the right way. You have to be more aggressive than that and more litigious than that.
Well, it's interesting because you hit on a couple points, and, you know, where I find that you're unique is that a lot of foreign nationals come for the advanced degree, right? I mean, you're talking about we're in an undergrad program. And so, you know, you're talking about even at a younger age entering into the US, technically still, you know, a minor, right, at 17 based on US law. And, you know, I think the other thing is, you mentioned the lawsuit, and that's what is really crazy about it all, is it's not only the time that was spent, but the money. and money that you spent, your employer spent. And I think that that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand when you start looking at, high skilled individuals such as yourself who have received denials when it comes to adjustment of status,
Mm-hmm.
and the time and money that went into that, right? All the number of L1Bs, right, or L1A as well, right? And then just the expense of an employer to go through the perm labor process. I can tell you, the time and the money that's dedicated to that is pretty crazy. For at the end of the day, it's decided by a bureaucrat. And I think that, to me, that's, a couple of the points that you made that a lot of folks don't really fully understand. And to go back and tell yourself that, and you see a lot of what's being reported in the news recently around the dwindling number of international students coming to the US, some of that associated with the travel ban, of course, some of that associated with that F1 interpretation of
Mm-hmm.
on-site classes, right?
Mm-hmm.
But as a whole, you're seeing those numbers drastically drop. And you mentioned Harvard, alumnus of Harvard. Harvard was one of the first to file a lawsuit on that ban.
Yeah.
And that's because, listen, a lot of money is at stake for these institutions and universities. The international student collects a hefty price for them. And so, that's a lot of the untold about this cycle,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
folks like you that get caught into it.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say, in sort of in their defense, I don't know how much money they got from me, because I got a grants and financial aid coming in. Again, I mean, how amazing is it that Americans, open up their wallets to help people like me go to the best schools in the world. But I mean, I would say that, institutions like Harvard, it's wonderful that they came to the defense of their students, but I think there's a lot more that they could do and they should do. I mean, in my day, I would have been amazing if there had been, lawyers that could have been consulted for students, because, a lot of people say, well, don't you just know when you're coming to the US that this is what it's going to be like? And people say, well, if you're coming to the US, why don't you do a sort of cost benefit analysis and then, just decide to go to Australia? The truth is that if America, its sort of foundational idea is as a country of immigrants. And so it is completely counterintuitive to tell yourself that you won't be welcome, especially if you feel like you're bringing sort of talent and capabilities. I mean, if there are people who want to give you a job and people who want to give you a place at a great university, then, you think like, well, gosh, the country wants me. But in fact, it doesn't. And, I think that the kids who are crazy enough to come to the US from far-flung places are also the ones that believe that, they'll be able to make it somehow. And that's how they kind of get trapped. So I think that employers and universities should do a lot more to either, make sure students know what they're getting into, or, fight for better immigration policies that can allow them to stay.
Right. Yeah, that's I mean, I think that's what this channel was. One of the reasons I started it was to talk about those changes and how necessary they are, because the cycle is never ending. And, we'll continue to see stories like yours. I mean, there was the Dr. Pranav Singh story. There was another story that's been circulating around the medical doctor in Detroit that's looking to go to Canada. And, I told the story of my really good friend who moved to Australia. And, I will never leave this country, but if I were an immigrant here in the high-tech space and I'm weighing my options between Canada and Australia, no offense to your home country, but I think I'd prefer the weather in Australia a little more. That's just me. That's just preference.
That's fair. Winters are not for everyone.
No, I'm a Southerner, born and raised, and I don't think that anything below 32 is really meant for me, but but I digress.
No, and I think that's the thing, because people say, also something I hear is, well, why don't you just go somewhere else? You'll be fine somewhere else. And I'm very lucky that is absolutely true. The UK is wonderful, and I'm very lucky that I can live and work here. Canada's fantastic. There are plenty of great alternatives, but at the end of the day, nothing compares to America in terms of scale and vibrancy and opportunity and energy, and of course, there are plenty of difficulties and flaws and debates that are happening, but America was really the place that I felt like I was home, and it's a country I love and always will.
I think it comes down to it's the desire to be a part of something bigger than you. And I think that's, a lot of times we talk about this American dream and what that is. And I think it really comes down to just that desire, right? That just the opportunity that's granted to us here and that freedom, and it fuels that fire. So,
and that's a bit the difficulty there, I think, is you're kind of leading this parallel life, because when you are stuck in a 80-year backlog, like so many people are, when you are in, and I think this is something that a lot of Americans don't know, but every time you even slightly shift your job description or even get promoted, you are putting your underlying application in jeopardy, because suddenly things need to be adjusted and changed. Right. So you are really, really stuck in where you are, and any little move can, again, jeopardize things.
Right.
And so the trouble with that is that you're surrounded by all this opportunity and freedom and all this energy, but you yourself are frozen in time in a lot of ways. And so what I suggest to people is that the trade-off isn't between, America, its opportunities and its freedoms, versus somewhere else. It's actually, that isn't accessible to you, as a lot of the time you are circumscribed. Your opportunities are very much circumscribed by the rules of your visa. And you cannot break them. So really, if the choice is between that and somewhere else, the math gets a little bit different, because you aren't choosing between the American dream and something else. You're choosing the merit-based immigrant life. In existence versus another place.
I never thought about it from the visual concept of frozen in time. I think that just really paints a picture that a lot of folks like me don't understand. I relate to it because I know individuals in that situation. But yeah, that's an interesting analogy. I hadn't really thought about that. I've noticed that, more recently you've become a lot more active on Twitter, speaking out for the need for immigration reform in the U.S. and using your story, as an example to do so. What's been motivating you to speak up?
Well, I guess, I've never been quiet about anything in my life, so it comes to me relatively easily. No, but in all seriousness, I mean, a lot of people are in situations where they can't speak out because they're afraid to. They're afraid to because it could be misconstrued by their employer. They're afraid because they don't know what's being recorded, but what might leave a paper trail that will lead to somebody looking askance at an application. And also, there's just sort of the unknown unknown. I mean, what if something changes and something I said 3 years ago winds up being used against me? Then there is a certain sort of level of fear that people have. Once I gotten the bad news, I frankly felt like I had nothing to lose, and all I had was, all I could do was gain from telling my story. And the reason I sort of did it was twofold. The first is that I hope that I can speak on behalf of some people who are in the same situation, with the complete recognition that there are a lot of people in much worse situations. People who don't really have great alternatives, or, people who, I waited 14 years, they're waiting 20, 30, 40, 50 years. They've got children who are going to age out at 21. But the other reason was because most Americans are not aware of this. When you bring up immigration, the first thought is of illegal immigration. When you bring up immigration difficulties, the first thought is of, refugees and people in much harsher circumstances. Most Americans don't know about the situation of highly skilled immigrants because it is just so unthinkable. Everyone just assumes that if you go to the best schools and have a great job and work really hard and pay your taxes and don't break any laws, they just assume that there's a way in. But that's actually not what shakes out. And if you sort of look at the numbers, and I often cite Twitter and elsewhere, it's sort of two sets of numbers, one coming from the Trump White House, one coming from the New York Times in 2014. So, you can pick your side. The numbers say the same. The worst way to come to America is through merit and skill.
Yeah.
And that's both because you see that bear out in the absolute numbers of people who come, and you also see it in the relative proportions, which actually tells you, it's funny sort of looking at it mathematically, it tells you it's not just about how many people apply which way, it's also that coming in through family is 10 times easier than coming in through your job and your employer and your skills and your education.
And you talked about on your article, I think something like 70% of all green cards are family based, and that's
12% are based on your employer. So, an avenue like mine, whether off a L1A work visa or an H1B work visa, but work visas are one way, and that's 12%. That includes the spouses of people coming in that way. So people like my husband. So it's actually only, maybe half of that are people that have come in that way. Then 70%, and that's composed, sort of 70% come in based on their family, and that's either spouses of U.S. citizens or people who are being sponsored by other family members, so brothers. And I'm not saying those people shouldn't be allowed to come in. Of course they are. Of course, an American should be able to bring in their spouse, but the proportions are what's really, really shocking. And then, by the way, just, in case anybody's wondering, the remainder, between the 70 and the 12 is made up of refugee and sort of humanitarian assistance, as well as the green card diversity lottery.
DV.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and it's something I've been talking about a good bit, is how the percentages are just out of whack, right? When we look at what are we promoting here. And, that's something that I've talked about a good bit. And I've also, of course, talked about the country cap quotas as it relates to employment-based preferences. But, I think the issue is when we start to look at DV, refugee, and these family-based, and we look at what their contributions are to our economy and society, and you weigh those against the individuals that are employment-based preferences of merit and skill, are those equal? When we start to talk about human capital war, which is something that I've been talking about a good bit here lately, are they equal? Do we win? And is it always about winning? No, but I think it's about the impact and the value, especially in times where we're sort of swirling, if you will.
Well, I think the first thing that I'd want to say is that this isn't a zero-sum game. Right? Just because one person comes in on their job doesn't mean another person, someone's spouse, can't come in. And we shouldn't see it that way. One, because it's factually incorrect, because you could simply have more people come in overall. And then secondly, because I think it creates, problematic dynamics, and you can sort of see the immigrant community and everybody's, it's like this, you get resentful of people who have an easier way through. And that's, that creates a lot of problems. But I think also to your point around competitiveness, it's fair to ask, what is the goal of immigration for a country? And there are many different ones. Some people say it should be a matter of social justice, and we should let in people based on dire need. Others say it's a matter of demographics and diversity, and therefore it should be based on genetics, which is what family is based on. And then you also hear the argument that we are in a very competitive universe, and that amazing advantage that America has had for 100 years isn't quite as large as it was before. And there's a cost associated to that. And I don't mean that you're losing out on university tuition. I mean that you're losing out on great researchers, and you're losing out on people who could start great businesses. And I guess the other cost here is just if you're forcing people who are really well educated, who had the chutzpah to come to the States to begin with, who really want to contribute, and you're trapping them in the system, that's also a huge waste of human capital, because they're just doing what they're allowed to do. They're not
Again,
doing
frozen in time. I think
what they want to do.
that's the analogy, right?
Exactly. Like, how many of these people could be starting their own businesses? And, H1Bs, for instance, have a lot of restrictions on whether you can start another business. Yes, you can set up a Delaware LLC, but you can't actually gain any money from your business in a material way, because that conflicts with the job that's sponsoring you. So, that's another major loss on the competitive front.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%.
And so, I know there's been a lot of change recently, and I guess I kind of wanted to throw it to you. You look at this whole topic from the perspective of competitiveness. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because what my career has been based on was, staff augmentation in large enterprises. And kind of through this pandemic, I mean, what happens in consultant-based staffing is it ebbs and flows, right? You see big cuts and the big bulk ads. But my concern, and something that I've talked about a lot, is the nearshore aspect, right? And the quality that is north of the border and that's been developing south of the border as well, in places like Monterey, right? In places like Vancouver, of course, Toronto. What happens there is that more centralized time zones, right? And so central times, but the quality at a fraction of the cost. You see a lot of tech startups starting to feel that value. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that the American worker is too expensive? No, it just means that I can get the same quality for a fraction of the price if I decide to offshore or nearshore. And so that isn't just around development, but with the automation and the way technology has evolved now, it's very easy for a small team in Canada to manage multiple applications, whereas that team used to be 25. Now it can be done offshore by 2 or 3 because of automation. And so that is something that I've been talking about a lot, because that to me is my biggest fear, is that we talk about restricting the flow of high skilled immigrants into the US. Okay. Well, when we do that, the impact of that is that people like you now are working in London, Toronto, Vancouver, Monterey, Costa Rica, right? You're talking about cheaper cost of living, more friendly to the immigrant high skilled worker. And if we continue to restrict, which I think that seems to be kind of uncertain at this point, I think that competitiveness is going to continue to be narrowed by Canada and Australia, and a lot of some of the other countries that we've talked about.
And I think, a lot of people, sort of adversaries of high-skilled immigration, will say, well, we should be investing in our own people. Why can't we have, native-born Americans with the same skills? And the truth is, yes, why not? Absolutely invest in. But as I was saying earlier, it's not a zero-sum game. I know sometimes there's so much anecdotal evidence and especially within sort of the H1B context, there's a lot of controversy there. And you hear of people who had to train their replacements, but then on a whole, the numerical evidence doesn't really support that. So, there are certainly, problems and issues to be resolved here, but it's not a zero-sum game. Just because you bring your own immigrant, that doesn't mean you're taking a job, away from someone else. So overwhelmingly, Americans are job creators. And one more thing is that it's always strange to me that people channel and focus the argument around job stealing on people who are 12% of the immigrant base. So nobody seems to begrudge family-based immigrants the roles that they take. So it's curious that it's just that one group.
Why do you think that is?
I think partly it's a absence of sort of knowing the stats. It's only 12%. Granted, there are more visas, right? But when it comes to green cards, it's just 12%. So a lot of people just don't know that, and it's not. It's a labeling thing too. If you call it, at this point, the H-1B is really vilified, and it's a bit of a it causes a spark with a lot of people. But you hear work visa or employment based, so you assume that's where your ire ought to be focused. But yeah, there's just there's such a dissonance there. It's like, what, you don't have that same problem with the other 80%. So
right.
88%.
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to when the cap was expanded to the over 200,000 and then kind of walked back. And I think a lot of people in that late 90s, early 2000s, and sort of the dot-com boom, if you will, I think that a lot of this rhetoric is based on 20 years ago. And I think it became,
like the policies and the numbers are
correct. And it's become easy, and it's something that's it's easy to pile onto. And I think that, and it's not that some of it isn't warranted, right? There's been a lot of documented fraud, and when you look at kind of the way the integrators have flexed their muscles on the lottery and gamed the system, so it isn't unwarranted, right? But I think it comes back to, there are jobs that I know for 100% fact that there just are not enough Americans, or there aren't any that have that particular skill. And I did a video, it came out about a month ago, and it was around the H1B workforce grant program. And it talks about training up unemployed or underskilled Americans and kind of what the purpose behind it is. And my point around that program is that, why use H1B as the moniker? Why not call it, American High Skilled, workforce program? It's to continue to use a work visa in a workforce grant program. To me, just is the continuation of the current administration's like piling on of that, and using it as sort of the anti rhetoric. But I think the thing that tells me is that we know, kind of based on some of the discussions that are happening right now, that things could be changing. And I guess question for you as an outsider, and that's, now that the election results are over, you've had some time to digest it. What are your predictions for employment-based immigration in the U.S. for the next 4 years?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And I mean, certainly there are a lot of people who are very sort of optimistic. I'm a bit less optimistic, to be frank. And the reason for that is that, we didn't get to where we are today through just the sort of executive orders that have made things so difficult for some people. We got to where we are today through decades of ignoring the problem and kicking the can down the road and making tweaks that just made the system even more difficult to navigate and even more irrational. I came to America when George W. Bush became president, and there were Republican and Democrat administrations since then, and aside from some very minor tweaks, for instance, to sort of the OPT, there hasn't been any material change,
right?
And therefore, I think you can rescind some of the executive orders, but that just means we'll get back to where we were before, which is
nothing new,
and long H-1B waits, and nothing of what I've seen in President-elect Joe Biden's plan really addresses skilled immigration. And that's really unfortunate. I did see a version of his platform that did mention it. It was last on the list. So I would not hold my breath. I think we'll go back.
It's not in the first 100 days, for sure.
Definitely not in the first 100 days. Again, not for people like me and anybody watching that's a work-based, employment-based, or skills-based immigrant. I will say that if somebody decides tomorrow to overturn Trump-era denials, I would run to be first in line. But I'm definitely not expecting that to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting. I honestly, when you look at kind of the first 100 days and what's in store, I mean, it just is. It reads family-based immigration. It talks about illegal addressing the illegal immigrants, the 11
Mhm.
million undocumented, and then further down the list, as you said, it's the high skilled temporary foreign worker, employment based country quotas for green cards. And that's all I want to work with Congress on.
Mhm.
Right. And so, listen, I mean, and as alluded to yesterday, Georgia is in a double Senate runoff. We vote again on January 5th that for 2 seats that will decide control of the Senate. And so, it's very interesting when you start to look at that. I joked last week that, gosh, it just means more phone calls, ads, mailers, and everything that's coming our way. And um, earlier today, the morning news was on, and there were new U.S. Senate campaign ads already on the television. They didn't waste any time, and so I'm very interested to see how those play out because I think that could have a greater impact on the first 2 years. I honestly don't have any expectations for anything as it relates to employment based preferences, high skilled temporary foreign workers until May or June if, the results hold as being, uh, you know, said right now and
Yeah.
posted.
To be frank, I don't see either side doing much on this, unfortunately. And for me, a really good example of a paradox is something like the children of people waiting in line for green cards who age out. So there are a lot of efforts to, and just I guess for people who don't know the context here, if you're a parent and you're in a 10, 15, 20-year wait for a green card, and you have brought a child in with you, so that your child is not born in the U.S. That child, as long as they're a child, is on a visa that is dependent on you. But the moment they reach 21, if they haven't gotten that green card, they age out of the system. They no longer have a visa. Suddenly they're not allowed to be in the United States. And we're talking about kids who were not born here or were not born in the US, but effectively have grown up in the US. And as we all know, the kids of immigrants tend to do better at school and have disproportionately greater acceptance rates at some of the best universities. And those kids suddenly are foreign and they have to go back to India, Bulgaria, Chad, wherever their parents came from, or secure an H1B or an L1A or whatnot, and they're just sent to the back of the line. And so the idea is, well, hang on, children of immigrants who came illegally get protection, get temporary protected status under DACA. Why not include the children of legal immigrants into that? And I sort of, if you've gotten to the point of saying that, the system's pretty messed up, because they shouldn't. Like, yes, it would absolutely be great for these kids to be included under DACA, but they shouldn't need to resort to that at all, because why are the parents in 20, 30, 40, 50, 60-year lines? That's the part that has to be fixed. And I don't see much will on either side of the aisle to tackle some of these things, because the system has just gotten so complex and so it's gone beyond sort of tweaks and fixes. It needs more systematic reform. Although I don't see what's labeled as comprehensive immigration reform happening anytime soon. And even there, you're going to wind up with so many entrenched interests. And it's like a Jenga puzzle. You pull out one piece, the whole thing's going to come toppling down.
You're right. I think it comes down to where do they go first? Because there is a lot that is on their plate as it relates to immigration, and I think that what you talked about the DACA, but I think the term they're using is DALCA for those dreamers, and the legal child if you will, and be very interesting to see how they address, those, because a lot of stories out there about 21 and aging out and
Yeah.
having nowhere to go and
Not
trying to
enough.
get an
Not enough. I mean, people have no idea.
F1.
People don't know.
Yeah,
I tell people all the time, and they're like, "What?"
yeah,
Because they're, rightfully concerned about kids who were brought here through no fault of their own illegally.
right,
Rightfully, Americans are concerned about that. But then when you
right,
tell them about the story of the children of legal immigrants, it is so counterintuitive that half the time they don't believe you. So I
right.
don't think there are enough stories being told. And one thing that I
Mhm.
always try to say on Twitter is, if you can, write your story down, put it
Right.
on, if you can't find a place to publish it, self-publish on Medium.
Hmm.
If you are afraid of repercussions, write under pseudonym. But
Right.
if anything, there has been a little bit more awareness, recently, and so there's a bit of an opening to gain awareness, and I think
Hmm.
you played a very big part in that.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny you say that. I was around one of my neighbors last week, and she's very well educated, master's. I think she even has a 6-year master's degree, and she saw something on the news and was like, "Oh, it was talking about H1Bs," and she's like, "Oh, I know what that is," and she only knows that because of the channel and me, and so. I think that was like, okay, that's one of those like reassuring moments. Like, all right, I got through to somebody who's very well educated. I made her knowledgeable on a subject that she wasn't. And so, just to keep going, and but
Pardon my
also,
language, but I will not shut up about it.
yeah, I mean, and also, how it isn't about just keep talking about it, but it's also how do we draft reform, right? And that kind of leads me to my next question for you, and it's something that I think you and I've talked about, excuse me, a little bit, and that's if you could draft some sort of legislation that would be beneficial for the U.S. economy, for American workers, and honestly for folks like you, the world's best and brightest. What would that be? Do you have any thoughts or ideas on
Oh
what
gosh,
kind
I
of
don't know about world's best and brightest, but that's kind of you to say. No, I think
I don't know a lot of Harvard graduates, so I'll just leave it at that. I know a lot of Georgia Tech graduates that are some of the best and brightest here in
Georgia
Atlanta, but
Tech is good. No, I'd say, look, America is an exceptional country. 100%. I am a firm believer in American exceptionalism, to the sort of dismay of many of my foreign friends. But immigration is not a unique problem. It is not a unique issue. And there are a lot of countries out there that have found ways to make sure that that the wait for people who are highly qualified is not, many decades, or requiring endless litigation.
3 to 6 months in some cases for some of
Yeah,
the systems out there.
yeah,
Yeah,
and in many other countries, it isn't. Lawyers don't. First of all, you don't even need a lawyer.
right,
But secondly, you don't see lawyers joking about how the best thing for you to do is just to marry a citizen. I mean,
right,
it's not the easier route, and it is sort of. And I have to say, it's incredibly demeaning to be told, "Oh, well, you should have just married a U.S. citizen."
right,
Really? That's how you want the system to work? You want to incentivize, okay, legitimate or sham marriages? You don't want people to come in based on their merit. And I'd say that the countries that are managing immigration better are those that have, to some extent, a merit-based immigration system, and that's a point-based system. And of course, they're imperfect, plenty of problems, but that way, at least you do two things. One is you actually take into consideration a person's education and a person's work experience, a person's sort of contribution to the country. And then, number two, you make it a sort of transparent, visible system. And incidentally, I mean, I've heard, when I've brought this up, I've heard sort of counter arguments, but like, oh yeah, but we have the O visa. That's
right,
based. So, but that's largely reserved specifically for celebrities. celebrities in a field, celebrities,
music, art, yeah.
music, art, but also, people who have already become famous, as economists or whatever abroad, and who are brought on that. So it isn't about, potential, for instance. And the other difference that's important here is that in the US, if you are applying for a green card through your job, it is not you, the immigrant, who is applying. It is you're a third party to the process. Your employer is the applicant. They're applying on behalf of a role which you happen to fill.
Yeah.
And that means
the term is petitioner, right? I mean, they are petitioning on your behalf.
Precisely. And so you are just, you don't, I mean, most of the time, and this isn't law, but most of the time you don't get to see your application. So you don't know what's being put in. You don't have the right to appeal. It has to be the employer. So you are entirely beholden to your employer. And that obviously creates a lot of, strange dynamics because, while you're trying to hold down a job and keep everybody happy, you can't exactly push back. And that's actually a place where I feel that I hope, in the absence of significant regulatory reform, I would hope that employers could sort of step up and help empower their employees. I know this isn't possible with every employer, but, especially some of the big employers that have a lot of visibility, if they ensure that their employees who are in these situations get to see their application, get to drive the strategy, which they technically can, but in effect do not, we might be in a better situation, because then, rather than having to go with your employer's lawyer, you could find your lawyer that perhaps is, has your individual interests at heart as much as it has the employer's interest along with the beautiful procurement contract they've signed for however many years, so
well, and you're paying them on your own retainer, so that they are sort of a third party, if you will, in that situation. And I think you said something very interesting, and you and I had talked about this before, and I go back to all the perm labor cases that I process. When it came time to the I-140 phase, there was a very small packet sent to the beneficiary for their signature. Everything else was kept removed from that. And so, I think that's one of the things that a lot of folks don't understand when they're getting into that, is that the employer doesn't have to share that information with you. There is some that they do, and you have to know when and how to request that. And so that's a great point, Christine.
You have to have a mini JD. I mean, then I remember people often say, well, why don't you just, it's an application. Why don't you fill that? It's not an application. You don't get to fill it out. It is a court case. It is a legal case that is mounted by a legal team that is basically executing a multi-year strategy to hopefully fulfill the preferences of the USCIS official that looks at your file. And
the bureaucrat. I mean, at the end of the day, it's what it is.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I know we've talked about merit a good bit. I'm a big proponent of a merit-based system. I've talked about it a lot, championed it. I think it would be, a system that could be an answer to a lot of problems that we have as it surrounds employment-based preferences. Do you think it could work in the US?
I don't see why not. It works elsewhere. And what do we mean by work? What's the objective here? Is it bringing in people who have talents and skills and education to sort of bring economic value to the country? Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Can add in components that make sure that you're not just coming to America for the money, but that you actually want to contribute to the country, that you want to be part of the nation, not just work in the country. Yeah, you can. I mean, when you're applying for citizenship, there's a citizenship test. There's no reason that there shouldn't be a component like that for a green card. And you can see, do people volunteer in their community? Do they do more than just their job? There are plenty of components like that that could be part of it. Just depends what Americans want.
I've called it the H1B EAD in the past too, and put kind of 10 categories and points around it. Because if you look at the other merit-based systems out there, they're all pretty similar.
Yep.
There's value on command of the native language, English in this case, the education, the offer letter and sort of compensation associated with that, the skill set and experience.
And by the way, none of that is really considered if you marry a U.S. citizen.
Right.
So the amount of scrutiny that 12% gets is pretty crazy.
Right. And then, some of the other things, they're speaking of marrying, you're talking about there's actually weighted value applied to the spouse's skill when we get into merit. And that adds to the overall individual who's applying. Then there's value on age and things like that. And I think that, to me, that just kind of that becomes the answer to eliminating a lot of the H-1B fraud that's consistently thrown out rhetorically as being rampant. But it also will help in this sort of the backlog that a lot of individuals have knowingly stood in line, but knowingly, because that's what the system and the cycle is. The unknowingly part about that is that you're going to be stuck in that until most likely you pass away and perish.
Yeah.
And so I think that to me is, where the breaking point comes back to when I really started to do my research on, the green card backlog and knowing what I know about the H-1B system. To me, it comes back to merit. And awarding individuals based on merit and skill, I think will foster innovation. It'll foster technology advancements here in this country, like unforeseen and unimaginable.
Absolutely.
But I think now, and the scary part about that is, in 2016, President Trump talked about a merit-based system. We saw that in the Cotton Bill in 2017. There were these waving murmurs that were coming in July that there was an executive order looming around merit, and then nothing, right? And then, based on the results we're seeing now,
and the exact opposite.
A Biden plan is not a merit-based plan. And so, hopefully they are willing to listen. We'll see. I think we'll see. I'm not going to stop talking about merit. You and I think that's one of the things we really agree on pretty extensively is that a merit-based system could work. What's the why behind it? What are we looking to accomplish? If that's clearly defined and the categories and the points are clearly defined, based on the electronic advancements that we've had, it could be easily implemented. And the problem is that you've got a lot of attorneys who are going to lose out on immigration fees who would fight that merit-based system tooth and nail. And that's just unfortunate because I'm friends with a lot of really good immigration attorneys, but they don't spend a lot of time in court.
Some bailout.
Right. There you go. Exactly. So you've spoken out on my behalf on Twitter, and thank you so much for that. Just really appreciate that so much. I can't even begin to tell you how much that means. But what led you to me and the H1B Guy platform?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I guess I started getting more active on Twitter this past summer when there were a lot of there were the COVID related travel bans, but not so much that as much as the bans on students. And so I felt like that was an important opportunity to tell people, hang on, this is just the tip of the iceberg. Like if suddenly people were paying attention to that problem, and I thought, okay, here's an opening to tell people more about how highly skilled immigration works for all these people. Like this is again, the tip of the iceberg. And so to bring that story to light, I shared that on Twitter. And then as I got into these discussions and debates, I saw that there was this reference in the community. Like when somebody wanted something clarified, it was to, at the H1B Guy. And so I was really curious because it's a great name, H1B Guy. And incidentally, I've actually never been on an H1B, so we've had this whole conversation and mentioned that.
Isn't that funny?
But it's sort of, that's what everybody knows when we talk about employment-based visas. And so I discovered that the H1B guy was not a lawyer. So that was the first really startling thing, is that, there's this really big need for somebody to explain this in real world terms.
Right.
And you are that guy. And,
Mhm.
on top of that, you actually know all the legal stuff. So
Mhm.
it's very intimidating because, you know, all the minutia of it without actually being a lawyer. But I think that's increasingly what people need, because as the law becomes essentially impossible to navigate, I mean, even lawyers themselves bemoan all the changes because it's such chaos. There's only so much they can do. Employers and immigrants need to have someone they can speak to who can explain how this stuff works in layman's terms and in business terms, and you're that person. So, if there's somebody out there looking for a understandable real world interpretation of what's going on, I would very much encourage them to reach out to the H1B guy.
Well, thank you so much. And it's funny because you start to think about, and I looked and I saw that there's just this gap, right? And the gap is that there's a lot of folks out there talking about the legal side of it, and then there's a lot of individuals out there giving their personal story. And I think that was the one thing that I realized made me unique, and that I do bridge that gap, right? And I think, when you and I talked a few weeks ago, to get prepared for today, you said something that just literally just made me beam, and that was, in kind of what you said here. Everyone knows what an H-1B is, at least as we talk about employment-based preferences, and that, you love the concept of the H-1B guy, but I'm so much more than that. And that's right. And I think that that's one of the things that when I launched this platform in kind of late June, some of the feedback I was getting was, you're more than just the H-1B guy. Have you thought about changing your handle? And I felt at that point I was just I was committed to it. I was very convicted in what this concept and platform was supposed to be. And so just, thank you. I've had some folks challenge me about, hey, what am I actually doing? And I think that this platform right now, and my voice, and having folks like you tell their story, is just a small piece of that. I want to do more. I want to engage more, and I want to do that for the benefit of everyone. Still trying to wrap my brain around how we're going to do that, and how we're going to be more of an advocate. But, again, thank you for the promotion and the support. I really
Absolutely.
appreciate that.
No, absolutely. And I think, honestly, there are a lot of people who don't know, who do want to know, but it can be such an inaccessible topic because it is so confusing and so complicated. People don't know who to go to. And that's both, again, individuals, but also employers. I mean, I've actually been, on the other side where I've had employees on visas, and I've seen employers have to, constantly redraft job descriptions. They're unable to move people. There's a moment where they start letting people go, and suddenly they can't find half the people because the news is spread, and all those people are terrified that they'll be deported.
Yeah, they're not showing up. They're
Really
suddenly sick with the flu for a
suddenly
week.
sick with the flu, yeah. And this is something that, if you're an employer, you don't if you're a manager, you don't expect that, some big chunk of your sort of mental space and acumen is going to have to be dedicated to understanding the minutia of one of the most complicated and convoluted areas of American law.
Yeah.
So we've got, I don't know if we I don't know if you've got any questions from folks.
Yeah, there are a couple. Did you think there was one you were going to throw at me, and then I had one more for you, and then there's one from Twitter, and we have one on YouTube.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think one of the, something that I'm curious about with something like your work on the platform as the H1B guy is, I'm curious, how do you engage with people on this topic? Because for me, something I found, and I don't know, people who are watching on the show, it's really difficult to talk to people about immigration, because you get people who are just against any immigration, who are sympathetic, but overall think it's such a problem. Who cares about the collateral damage? We just got to get this under control. And then on the other side, you've got people who, are really, really focused on human rights issues and social justice issues, who just don't have time for anybody who isn't, really in a horrible circumstance.
Mm-hmm.
So when you try to bring this up, it's extremely thorny. People get extremely emotional. I mean, my way of trying to engage, especially with Americans, is to ask them, how do you think it should work? And then you typically get some really interesting examples and really interesting responses. So, for instance, they'll say, I've had one gentleman say, well, they should, immigrants should serve in the military. That's, a lot of people can disagree with that, but that's not an unreasonable request. And then when you say, oh, well, I want people to come in on merit, I want this, and you say, okay, but do you think it's right that only 12% of green cards go to people based on their jobs and employment, and that it takes them 10 times as long and sometimes 80 years? That's one way where they say, well, that's crazy, that shouldn't be that way. Then you start kind of engaging in a constructive manner, but just I'm curious how you do it, because it is thorny.
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that's interesting about, not only my teenage years, but kind of growing up, right? Which is, I've been in chat rooms on the internet since the mid 90s. And, I grew up with social media. I didn't have Facebook for a long time, but I had MySpace, and I've had a Twitter account for a long time. So when I engage with folks, a lot of times it's, I've found something that I find interesting, or a point that they made that either I don't agree with, or that there are some challenges to. And so what I try to do is use kind of a fact-based point of view from my interpretation, meaning understand what the fact is, come up with my own interpretation, and use that to deliver, my point. And I think a lot of times what I get in terms of pushback is, I'll have folks that push back and say, well, I've already said that, or I've made that point. But when you start to use real hard data and numbers, I think that's where you uncover a lot of the fake out there, because there isn't a return. And it's not about being in an argument. It's about let's understand the fact, and let's state the fact, and then interpret what that fact means as we apply it to employers, as we apply it to employees. And so I think that's one of the things that I've done is, and really try to bridge both sides is, a couple of my really big supporters are very anti-H1B. And so that tells me that I'm doing something right. I'm earning that trust on folks that, are very much anti-H1B. But I also know that, my customer base, primarily 85-90%, are folks that are either on an H1 or came here on an H1 or are in some different status. And so what I try to do is understand, okay, this is why they're saying that. Now let's interpret that based on fact and come to a conclusion. And I think I've earned a lot of trust in being genuine and taking that approach.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's the way to go about it. Because I don't think, there's no point in sort of screaming and yelling about it. I also think, something that doesn't work is sort of playing the oh, sorry, was it frozen there? But the victim card, for example, because at the end of the day, of course, people who are in these still pretty great jobs are in a position, are in many ways in a positive position, but that doesn't mean that there's suffering isn't real, and that the frustration and sort of the emotional sort of tax there isn't worth considering. And I'm always sort of dismayed when people approach immigrant groups and say, "Oh yeah, but you're still better off than those guys," and it could be so much worse. You say that to somebody who's sick, that you don't have the right to complain about having this disease because someone else has cancer. And I think at the end of the day, this is such a complex problem that to try to bring it down to one group against another, that won't get you anywhere.
Yeah. Well, and what's interesting about that specifically is that I've fed the trolls before. But what I realized is that I'm not going to win that battle. And so while I may engage, I don't have enough time to win that battle. I just don't. What I've realized with some of the really far anti that are looking to troll is that I'm not going to win against them because they're willing to work relentlessly to get that instant gratification and response back. And so, and I think I've mentioned this, and I've talked about this before, is that if you've got people that are finding you and attacking you and talking negatively about you, you're doing something right.
Absolutely.
So.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to just kind of wrap up our Q&A and then we've got a couple of questions that have come in on YouTube and one from Twitter. But I wanted to ask you, we've talked a lot about how you've gotten to where you are. But what's next for Christine's career?
Oh gosh. Good things, I hope. And I did actually apply for the green card lottery, where there's will, there's way. I couldn't do it based on my education and my career. So maybe I can just do it on blind luck.
Random selection based on a lottery. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so maybe a few months from now, I'll be happily telling you how I just got a green card through dumb luck, not hard work. I'm certain that there are people, in line for their green cards who are thinking, is it worth it? And would I be better off elsewhere? It is very hard to leave the place that you call home. And so, emotionally, it was very difficult for me to sort of, as I say, cut my losses. I'd envisioned a future in America. I wanted to work in things like foreign policy and work on kind of explaining America to the rest of the world. And public diplomacy, for instance, and unfortunately, that I'm not going to be a groupie for a band that won't let me into their gig. Right. So I have to find a new vocation and a new passion, and there are so many exciting things going on in the world, whether it's kind of in even in the finance space. I mean, it's a great front row seat to a lot of the exciting developments in the world. So that's always my baseline. But I certainly am going to keep up my advocacy for merit-based immigration. It's not for myself, for the people who come next.
Well, and I will tell you, I think you're a very skilled writer. Your story on Medium just flows so well and just very, very descriptive and just paints a picture that really makes me angry, unfortunately. But that's a whole nother conversation, I guess, right?
Well, that's very to say. Thank you.
I know we've got several folks that are still joining us here on the live stream. If you have any questions, we're going to do a quick Q&A here, and then we'll wrap this stream up here in a little bit. But if you have any questions, we've got a few already on YouTube. Go ahead and post those in there. I'm going to pull up a Twitter question that came in from both of our big supporters. So at EVGuy7 had posted something on Twitter here and said, hoping something like tenure-based immigration process would allow us to retain, but also recover immigrants like Christine. And what EVGuy7 is referring to is a tweet from Alex Narasta discussing the permanent immigration registry and the concept of creating a permanent rolling legalization. Pretty complicated if you think about what this is implying here. Yeah. But I think what this does also, it tells me, Christine, is that there is still hope for folks like you who have had denials that are qualified based on merit. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because a lot of countries do have if you have been here legally with a job, paying taxes for 10, 20 years, then here you go, you can stay. And Canada has a version of that. The UK has a version of that where you sort of settled status becomes pre-settled status, settled status contributes to citizenship. But I think the one thing to consider is that however you reform the system, and I think everybody agrees that the H1Bs is sort of need of reform. You can't ignore the fact that there are a million people in line in a backlog, and there are so many people who are already in the system. So if you're going to change it, you can't have that impact everybody who's followed the rules and stood in line, however crazy that line and crazy the rules.
Right.
And so, this could be one way to address
a phase period. Yeah, I think I had called it, I mentioned the H1B EAD earlier, but I had mentioned using the H1B EAD as sort of a way to do that, having folks that have been in the country for at least 6 years that haven't approved I-140 to go ahead and be issued this, H1B EAD with advanced parole rights, because that's what it comes down to. It's freedom to choose, freedom of travel, freedom to determine their wages, right? And so, that's that. I think that this would fall in line with that, and so I think it's a great question. We'll definitely something to keep our eyes on. That's for sure.
Absolutely. It's you see it elsewhere. It exists in other countries. So it's definitely doable.
Well, and I think it also goes to the fact that, like, just because you're not currently out in the country doesn't mean that you still don't have this desire to be a permanent resident, right? And so there's, I think that's another good point. So these questions have come in here on YouTube, so I'll throw those out. I'm going to take this one here, Christine. It says, this is from Kapil Sharma. It's very easy to get GC after H-1B unless you're born in India. India is a big no-no. Well, I would say Christine's story is an example of it's not as easy as you may assume it to be. And Christine was on an L1A, which is, a managerial designation. And to me, ultimately, is very similar to like an EB1 based preference, right? And so, unfortunately, this is some of the assumptions that are made that just because I'm an H1B from India, I'm never going to get a green card. That's what's happening right now.
And that is true. I mean, so I would say that the part of the comment that absolutely makes sense, India is a big no-no. Absolutely, if you are born in India and on H1B, the wait is unconscionable. I mean, it's beyond absurd. Sometimes it's longer than somebody's lifespan, and I think the backlog is calculated with 200,000 deaths. That's according to Cato. Cato's work with this prominent DC think tank. But I would say that sort of two things. I mean, one is that no, it isn't very easy to get a green card after an H1B. It may be much easier compared to if you are from India, but it is by no means easy to do a labor cert. You have to, first of all, you have the lottery for an H1B. My company tried twice. I never got it.
Right.
But then once you have the H1B, you have the labor cert. That is a very thorny thing. A lot of those applications get audited, and then there is still a long wait. And I'd also say that, once you go down the path of kind of balkanizing the immigrant community and saying, well, it's just about this, or those guys have it easier, and it's worse there, that winds up not being very productive, and no, it isn't very easy.
No, it's not. I mean, I think the 600 plus, and then the dependents tagged to that prove that 1.2 million number, that we've talked about. It verifies that. So this came in from Vishnu Vardhan. Vishnu is always joins us here on the live stream. So Vishnu, thank you. Hey guys, I'm getting 80K right now. Is it possible for me to apply H1B next time? I'm a master's student. And then he had a follow-up to that says, did the wage increment policy for applying H1B was applied or active? A new lawsuits were filed against it. Do you guys have any news about it? So he's talking about the interim final rule, and then the H1B lottery changes, which have been mentioned as well. As part of it, that going to the electronic, I believe, system which they've done, but using the wage determination as the means for selection versus random lottery selection. So I think the question, this is once you have your master's degree, you're making 80K, most likely working on an EAD OPT or EAD OPT STEM. Depending upon your job requirements, I'm going to guess you're probably at a level 2. I don't know the MSA. So MSA meaning the city location, the metropolitan geographic area to which you're physically working in. But I would say right now that 80K number probably would need to be increased by about 30% based on the wage level increases that I've seen. I know that the lawsuit on the IFR was filed back on Monday. I think it was October 10th, maybe the 17th. I'm sorry if I have that wrong. But I don't expect anything on that for a few more weeks. Those cases generally take about 6 weeks to hit the district federal court.
And this is why the H1B guy is amazing, because he knows all this detail. So thank you for handling the details. I'll just point out something really, heartbreaking in that sentence. Is to say, I'm a master's student. Can I apply for an H1B? No,
right.
No individual can apply for an H1B. Only
clarification,
an employer.
The employer, right?
Yeah. So you, as an individual, no way.
No, in my experience, you can very friendly suggest or ask your employer to do so. And if they've never done so, Vishnu, please have them contact me. I can definitely help them and what that process would need to look like. But thanks for joining the stream today. Really appreciate it. So this comes in from Harish Bayaravapu, and he asks, there's a lot of backlash from Americans that H-1B is cheap labor. Americans getting their foreign replacements. It is really directed towards Indians because we're not Caucasians. E.g., if Disney hired a Caucasian on H-1B to replace a person who had been working in the company for 20 years or so, would they still stand on the national platform and say I was replaced by a Caucasian H-1? I mean, this is where we get,
that friend is, some people are like, geez, if somebody who looks like me can't make it, what hope is there for them? Right. I don't like that kind of, racialized perspective.
Yes, me either. I'm not a big fan, but it's the truth.
Yeah, I mean, what I say is, like, my husband is Scottish and lived not too far from Trump's golf course, and I'm Canadian and Eastern European, like two of President Trump's 3 wives.
Right.
So
here you are. Right.
If it was a blatant kind of discriminatory situation, you'd think I'd wind up in a different place, but I didn't. So yes,
I think that's something that not to allude to your interview on Tucker Carlson, but I'm going to, and that was the point that was driven home, by him, is that, wow, America's loss is London's gain. And he talked about, if you can't make it, what does that mean for others, or something along the lines of that context. And I think that that's a great point. And, one that's interesting is that I actually had a couple of H-1Bs from South Africa that used to work for me. And what was interesting, though, and you talked about the movement from employer to employer, and there being like a 12-month policy to apply for perm labor. And I can tell you that there's a lot of my former employees out there that will tell you we had some very heated discussions around, I can't do it before 12 months. In some cases, it was longer than that. And that's because it was all financially driven from the corporate side of the employer, not because I didn't want to do it. It wasn't about me, right? And so I think that that's the thing here when we start to look at where somebody's from and what they do, right? And kind of the different stories associated with that. The H-1B in its original intent, while it is dual intent, was meant to be high-skilled temporary foreign worker, not necessarily 70% from India. It just wasn't. But the integrators figured out how to game the system and flood it with multiple applications. And so that's why you saw this explosion. But the other thing, too, is, and one thing that India does very well, is that they begin training on technology at a very young age. Mm-hmm. And so, whereas here in the United States, we're doing, English literature from mid 14th century, right? And, there is more focus on the arts. And I think that that's where the difference becomes, is that at a young age, technology drives success in the Indian culture.
Mhm.
And so, whereas here, the American culture just wants it to work, doesn't care how. And so
Mhm.
I think that that's to me kind of where the line of demarcation is. And unfortunately, there is systemic racism associated towards Indian nationals. It's a small group, it's a very far right group, but it is out there 100%. It's out there. You can find it, and it's ugly, and I don't like it, and I will continue to speak out against it.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% right to do so. Yeah.
So, Ramakrishna, thank you. I don't think Rama has missed a live stream, Christine, since I've started doing these. Literally, I think he's made every Stamp It Out that I've done and every H1B Guy live, unedited and unscripted. I've had the chance to talk with him a few times. Just a really great guy. So, Ramakrishna asked if diversity is a problem, then why not have the country cap on H1B? That would ease the backlog. You want to take a shot at this? Because I definitely have an opinion on this one.
Why have
So,
a cap at all?
so
Or
what he's talking about here is he is talking about having a country cap on H1Bs.
oh,
So
right,
for
on the pieces to match the
correct, absolutely, and there is a very much a small growing sentiment towards this. It's
yeah.
becoming very popular.
Why would you, and not fool is the wrong word, but why would you put more and more people into this insane backlog? Because I guess for folks who don't understand this, the green cards are limited to a certain number for each country.
Correct,
And
7%
yeah,
quote country cap quota annually.
exactly. And that is, those numbers don't get updated very often. But at the same time, the visas that allow you to come to the US are not capped. And so you wind up with this insane imbalance where, because there are so many immigrants coming from certain countries over others on skills-based visas, you then wind up with this insane backlog. And because these aren't limited, these are. Um, with this question, I would actually question this idea when we say that diversity is a problem, because it is, the country caps are applied to work-based green cards.
Yeah,
They're not
employment-based preference,
any
right?
other green cards.
Right.
There's a diversity lottery, but that's, a tiny percentage, right? But there's no such cap on family-based visas. So there's something very inconsistent here.
There's no cap, but they are listed in the visa bulletins every month. Some of the family-based preferences, because there are certain countries that have more requests than others. So they are.
By the way, that they define the categories eligible for the green card lottery.
Yep.
I know this because some countries appear on some years and disappear on others based on how many immigrants are coming in. So it feeds it, doesn't limit it. So I find it a little bit odd when people, talk about restricting based on country of origin for that 12%, and yet claiming that it's because of diversity, and yet don't apply that same principle to the other 70%. That tells me it's not actually about diversity.
Yeah. No, I think that you're right. I'm not in favor, at least right now, of quota on country caps for H1Bs. I think that kind of goes against what the H1B original intention was. But I also go back to, I understand the numbers and I understand where the primary bulk of lottery applications are coming from. I will say that this new rule around the lottery and the wage is something that may have an impact on that. So I think we'll see a significant reduction in the 2022 fiscal year cap cases. So, but right now, I think if we want to ease the backlog, it goes back to some sort of EAD with advanced parole. I called it the H1B EAD. I've seen it referred to as the I-140 EAD. Let's give all of these individuals an employment-based green card backlog, these advanced parole rights, and then begin to eliminate that backlog, right? Those that are in EAD to permanent residency. and have some sort of new merit-based system implemented, right? But that's
Solve
just
the backlog.
total
Don't do it. I mean,
that's total visionary, right? And probably pretty far out there. But so this comes in from Sanith. Sony says, "Hey there. If someone has a cap exempt H1B, then how practical is it to expect a cap subject employer to apply for H1B in March? Hope it gets picked up and wait till October when it kicks in." I've come across this a good bit. So, Christine, I'll just kind of explain to
go
you what
for
this
it.
is. So, a cap exempt H1B is someone that's working for like a nonprofit organization. Okay. So a U.S. Medical facility, right? That may be nonprofit, a university, or a
Thank-
research institute of some sort.
Yeah.
So these are not subject to the cap, meaning they don't have to go into the lottery. They can be requested. They don't require they don't fall under the 65,000 or 20,000 advanced degree numbers. I've come across this a good bit where folks are working as like data scientists in a research institute, but they really want to work sort of in the private sector. And so what happens is that they'll begin to shop right now, and I don't mean shop as a negative thing here, Sanish. I want to be honest with you, but shop as in uh, um, looking for an employer who's willing to sponsor them in the lottery, right?
Mhm.
And so, really, I mean, any employer can sponsor anyone for an H-1B, whether you're here in the U.S. working in a different status or outside the U.S. If you qualify based on the requirements of the job, right? And that there's an offer letter, and there's several other things that are associated with it. But I'm just going to assume that Sanish here is a research data scientist. So if you were to find a private employer, a private institute that'd be willing to sponsor you, you can continue to work under your cap exempt. And if you're selected in the 2022 lottery, your change of status then would take place beginning in October 1st of 2021. So it's definitely possible. It's not common. I don't see it a lot, but it's definitely possible. So
Make sure you have a really good lawyer.
yes, absolutely, absolutely,
That's
and
the of it, right?
and all your enter and exit documents and offer letters and education evaluations and all of that. It's all very important and part of the process. So Vishnu had a quick follow up here, just saying, oh, sorry, let's see. Will the next lottery go? Will the next lottery going to random lottery or a merit based one? He's referring to for H1B here. And
Yeah.
he says that if it is merit based, since the company I'm working for was a mid tier one, it will be very difficult for the company to pay huge salaries. Yeah, I think this is what the outcry has been. Is it's really now what it appears to me, and the way I'm interpreting this is that your employer would submit your case electronically. They're going to designate your compensation, and that it's no longer going to be about random selection. They're going to take the top 60,000 salaries being offered. That's the way I'm interpreting it. So I think, yeah, this is definitely going to present a challenge for a lot of the mid-tier, middlemen, third-party, corp-to-core type that are out there, because ultimately they're not paying top dollar. They're not paying bottom dollar either. They still have to pay at or above a prevailing wage determination. And if you're level 2 or level 3, you're probably 75,000 or up, depending on your MSA. But yeah, I mean, I think this is the thing about the H1B IFR and the wage rule, and then the lottery announcement that came out, that really has everyone in this huge tizzy, because you're talking about just the inflation of the wage levels so much higher than what even their American peers are making. And so it just really becomes mind boggling when you look at how significantly increased those wage levels were. Um, but
And
yeah,
this,
go ahead. Sorry,
actually,
Christine.
this was one of the executive orders, or linked to an executive order, correct? So,
Correct. Yep.
and this is where it becomes a funny political question, because by all accounts, President-elect Joe Biden wants to rescind a lot of the Trump era immigration executive orders, but this is not on the list. This isn't a priority. So as much as I'm sure we can expect, travel bans to be lifted, and sort of, the issues that students are having, that's going to be solved, there will be things that President-elect Biden won't change. I don't know about this one because, as I said, merit-based immigration is just not on his list.
I think what Vishnu is referring to with the merit term here is the compensation selection process, right? And I think hey, listen, that is a step in that direction. If we're being honest with what that is, right? It is. I mean, I think the thing for me that I've been very vocal about is that of all the H's that I process, we never had a level 1 work on our W-2. And I can't ever remember a level 2. Our wages just were never that low. It just wasn't how it works. So this low, cheap labor debate is something that's kind of no pun intended, foreign to me, because it wasn't really a factor in terms of how we process cases. So Javier asks, can I apply for H1B on overstayed tourist visa? Thanks, Javier. Javier, I would tell you that if you want to apply for an H1B in the fiscal year 2022 lottery, I would exit the US before you began that process. So what I mean by that is that I would have your employer's offer letter state a date that were after your exit of the US. I would have any payroll determinations, any document evidence, anything like that. I would do that after you vacated the US. If you're currently here on an overstay, which unfortunately is illegal,
do not break the law.
No, and if your case is selected by random selection or based on your merit compensation, a request for further evidence is 100% undoubtedly in your future, and you won't be able to meet the evidence requirements. And so you basically have wasted a lot of time and money. So my advice to you is, if you want to take that approach, is to plan to exit the US and then begin that process while you're outside of the US. And if you're selected, then your visa can be processed in consular processing, and it makes it nice, smooth, clean, and easy for you. If it really is that easy, it's not, but it will definitely help to clean it up. But to Christine's point, do not do anything illegal as it comes to Department of Homeland Security and USCIS, because they do not play around with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Follow
Yep. Follow the rules. So just kind of a follow-up here from Ramakrishna. He says, thanks for replying my question. How can we resolve GC backlog? Not that I'm for country cap on H1B. Sorry for framing my question properly. So I think what he's wanting to know here is, how do we solve the green card backlog for country cap quotas and employment-based preferences versus we were talking about the H1B quota, which still was a great topic and point to make. Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at it, and we've talked about Senate Bill S386 ad nauseum here on this channel. I know we have it today with Christine, but as I've said, there's very few days for it to come back up in the remaining 2020 session. I think it will die this year. But I am aware of several advocacy groups that are currently working behind the scenes. And if it is not, they're not holding out hope on S386, but if for some reason it were to die, I would expect something to be introduced in May or June of 2021 session. At least that's what I'm hearing. So Javier said, when H1B is pending, can I wait for a decision in U.S. on overstayed tourist visa? So I think what he's asking here is if he has his application selected but is still pending. No, because anything that you do on an overstay is going to require consular processing to have your visa stamped and approved. So again, going back to, and I don't mean this to be negative, but if you are on an overstay, you are in the U.S. illegally, or if you know someone who is, not assuming that it's you, maybe we're talking about a friend of yours. If you're doing so, it's still going to require consular processing. Your change of status cannot be done while you're in the U.S. Let's see. Chetan Tande asks, will the H-1B wage rule survive litigation by H-1B lottery for next year, 2022? I don't know. I mean, I have a very strong feeling that we could see some sort of injunction ruled. I think that the wage levels in the Department of Labor statistics that were used were significantly inflated. I think that we'll see evidence provided that shows that, but I do expect some sort of wage rule increase.
Mm-hmm.
Christine, any thoughts on that?
No, that sounds right. I mean, that is, to your earlier point, to the extent that there is a move towards a sort of economics value-based perspective on H-1Bs, then that would probably be it. Trying to make it so that, the higher the salary, the higher the likelihood.
Mm-hmm.
So I would expect, if anything sticks, it would be that in some capacity.
And I think you made a great point. For those that are still with us, we have over 20 folks joining us. That's a new record here on the H1B Guy channel. So it just took you, Christine, for us to get there. But Christine, you make a great point. And I think the point here is that if there is some sort of change, be prepared for what that means for you, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone's case is different. And the way that will impact everyone is different, and so that's a great point. Sanish, Christine says, "Hey, your guest was on point. I do work in data science research and exploring CAP H1B, O1, or EB1 options. Which, let's see, we've hit on O1, we've hit on the EB1 today, and we've discussed H1B ad nauseum. That's why you come to the H1B Guy channel here on YouTube. And as Christine said, listen, I think that's one of the things that makes me unique. It's my ability to understand the employer perspective, but also to know the individual perspective and the immigration attorney perspective on all of this. I've seen a lot of cases, and a lot of them just are so far out there. How do we figure it out, right? And so it really is. I just love to problem solve and make these guesses because I've seen it, and your situation is not unique. It's not. And there's a lot of folks. I always say November 1st, my phone used to start blowing up with people calling me, asking me, are you doing any HCAP lottery cases for next fiscal year? And that's it consistently starting in November is when it would begin. So, Christine, we only have a couple more and then we're going to wrap up. So thank you for all your time. Chetan says, wage-based selection, better instead of lottery. PhD with high salary do not get H-1B, but low salary people with luck do. It is funny that H-1B spouses get H-4 EAD, but not talented O-1 visa holder dependent. Great.
More paradoxes in this.
Check. I mean, Chetan, you're exactly right. And I think Christine, you talked about this earlier when we're talking about very little immigration reform kind of through President Bush and President Obama's administrations. But one of the big things Obama did do in the executive order was that H-4 EAD, which has been hotly debated and a topic of conversation through the Trump administration. I was a big proponent of the H-4 EAD when it initially came out because it had some real value to it. The problem is that a lot of spouses that had been here in the U.S. hadn't worked for 2, 3, and 4 years. So what that created is almost like an entry-level type W-2 resource that flooded the market. I think that was back in 2015, if I believe May 2015 timeframe. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about the O1 and what that means, right? Researchers, we talked about the arts and things. Is that being sort of merit? Maybe that's the direction that we go with the merit designation. I'm not sure. But the PhDs are a big one, right? You're talking about high salaried, highly educated, and still are just put in this random selection and told no year after year.
Or they just don't go for it. I was speaking to a
Yeah.
friend yesterday who's a neuroscience PhD. We went to undergrad at Harvard together, and she was applying, looking at a job in the equities and in finance. And you get to the description of the job, and they want people with PhDs or PhD MDs, experience in finance, and then at the end they say, we will not sponsor anybody.
Yeah.
Basically, not in those words, obviously, but they basically, you need not apply. So it's not just about whether people will or won't get the H1Bs, but whether jobs for which they are imminently qualified will open themselves up to that level of risk.
Yep. And Sarah says, how can a student completed master on F1 visa can apply for the H1 with new wage level rule?
So I'll take a stab at that one. If he's a fresher, or fresher sounds very British to me. So I don't know, maybe you're
explain that to me, because I don't know what that means.
A freshman.
Freshman. Okay, got it.
If you're from this side of the pond, greetings from the UK. But the problem here is a student. No individual can apply for the H1B, and I know maybe that's what we mean. Maybe you mean an employer. But an employer who must. So first you have to get the job, then you have to convince your job to get an H1B, and then you have lottery for an H1B. And frankly, that's why I didn't bother staying after graduation. I went to the UK to do my master's there, because I saw my friends go through this, and it's a nightmare. So you can, if you get the job, you can have that job using something called OPT. And then if you're lucky, your employer will file for an H1B, but not all employers do, simply because it's expensive and difficult, and it's a bit of a strange kind of political dance. Then they have to get it. And then you are, again, I don't know where you're from, but then if you actually want to have the freedom to get promoted and change jobs and, do all the things your American classmates do, you need a green card. And the route from H1B to green card is a whole other nightmare. And so to the H1B guy asked me at the beginning of the session, what advice would I give myself as a 17-year-old, coming to Harvard? It would be to not expect that what got me here will keep me here. So I would go see a lawyer. I would consider other countries and other options and exit options. And then I would really, really think about the trade-off I'm going to make. And if you want to understand a little bit better what the employer dance looks like, my buddy William Hahn, who went to Yale, wrote his own story and focused a fair amount on how delicate a dance it is with your employer, because you're entirely at their bequest. You cannot apply for an H1B as an individual.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny that you say that, because it is employer driven, and I'm going to guess Sarath may be from India originally. And you look at, okay, once you graduate, let's say with an advanced U.S. master's, you go into the OPT, then OPT STEM. You basically have 12 to 36 months to go work for an employer and convince them to sponsor your H1B. If you're from India, that is the process. Otherwise, you come here, you get your degree, and you leave. I mean, that really is what it comes down to.
That's the tragedy.
It is, and that's the cycle. So, Javier, no problem. Glad we could answer your question. Thank you for joining us. Sarath had one more where it says, will the new wage level rules be applied for H-1B cap exemption applications? So my answer to that question is yes, because you still go through the same process for cap exempt, which is there's an LCA, there's a prevailing wage determination. So all of those wage levels are determined during that portion of the process through the labor condition application that's certified by the Department of Labor. So yeah, I believe that until there's an injunction that restricts the current wage levels, yes, that will definitely be the case. So that was all the questions, Christine, that we got on YouTube. That was a lot. Thank you. I know that went a little longer than we had originally discussed. I'm just so glad to have you do the Q&A rapid fire with me. I just really appreciate it. Before we wrap up, though, I just want to give you the biggest thank you that I can for your support, for taking the time to come on this channel. to chop it up with me for an hour and 45 minutes on U.S. immigration live from London. Guys, I know Christine's had some visual with her camera, a little grainy here, kind of towards the last 20 minutes or so. But it's no fault of hers. She is in London. We are not paid to do this, so we are at the mercy of technology. But I know her audio was good. I heard it the entire time, and one more from chat says H4E80 existing means lobbying works as there is a large population of H1Bs. Maybe there are not too many O1 for people to lobby for. I think that you make a great point, Chet, and I've talked about this power in numbers, your power in numbers with your voices, with your assembly, and with your money. And if you can do those, you can influence American politics, no matter whether you're a voter or you live in the district. Remember that. You are a constituent, even if you're not a voter. And then Ramakrishna says, thanks for all the hard work. But I just wanted to get back to you, Christine. I love talking to you. I think that you and I share a lot of similar ideals. Your story, as I said, is one that makes me angry. I'm glad we got to talk about it today. You and I have been talking about kind of what may be next for you and I in the future. I look forward to more conversations around that. I genuinely appreciate your interaction and support through the social media channels. And I'm just so glad we could get together here today. And just from the bottom of my heart, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me on. And I'm just thrilled to see, an American who really cares and wants to do something about this and dedicates their time to it. So thank you for having me on.
Awesome. And go ahead and you can follow Christine on Twitter. That's at Mikolajuk. You can connect with her on LinkedIn as well. You can find her there. I'll have the link. I'll put her LinkedIn profile in the description as well. Links to her article on Medium. If you haven't, go read her story. There is also a link on her story to her friend William Hahn's story that's on Vox, where he makes a lot of great points that I think are very thought-provoking. And also in the description, I'll include her link to the video from her interview that was on Tucker Carlson back in February of 2019. Christine, I just wanted to kick it over to you. Anything before we wrap up?
Well, and thank everybody for who came in to watch and for your questions. And if there's one message that I would like to convey is to tell your stories. As much as getting yourself out there, may not mean anything for your individual situation. The more people tell their stories, the more hard it is to ignore. And I found that, given all the controversy right now, there's a window of opportunity to help more Americans understand what's going on. And when they're confronted with the facts and the numbers and just how absurd a lot of this is, it can get them to care and get them to vote and get them to be active on this, whether as voters or as employers. So, I just really encourage you to get your stories out there. It can be self-published, it can be anonymous, whatever you need. And I'm always happy to edit. So please do consider getting your stories out there because everyone's story is worth telling and worth reading.
Yeah, and that's a great sort of cue here. I think I mentioned to you this earlier, not on the stream, but when we were talking about the Stamp It Out Q&A interview series was one of the very first ideas I had when I was conceptualizing, okay, I'm going to do a blog, I'm going to do a YouTube channel, what kind of content am I going to put out there? And the Stamp It Out series was one of those. So if you'd like to engage with me, come on and tell your story potentially at a future date on one of the Stamp It Out Q&As, please reach out to me. I'd love the chance for you and I to speak and see if it makes sense. But with that being said, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. I'd like to ask you, if you haven't already, please like this video. Please subscribe to the H1B Guy channel here on YouTube and click the bell for notifications. I just want to say thank you. We broke streaming records here today on the channel. Christine, thank you for that. If you've made it this far, I just really appreciate your support. Thank you for me. Thank you for Christine from really the bottom of my heart. Just really appreciate it. The H1B Guy, your global source for all things H1B.